There are few more notorious names in English history, and few who are more mysterious or disputed. In the 5 centuries since her death, Anne Boleyn has been celebrated and damned. Her every action has been interpreted and reinterpreted. Was she a martyr, a schemer, or a victim?
Homewrecker, trollop, you would not believe the things that they love to call Anne Boleyn.
For many hundred years later, she was this devil woman who bewitched Henry and made him deviate from the true religion.
We have to take some of that reputation with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Her sister Mary is more elusive still. Where remembered by history at all, she is often dismissed as a fool, a slut, a disappointment.
I think her reputation as an infamous whore has been overstated.
She wasn't at all. Many girls had much more affairs than she did.
How much choice she had in becoming the mistress is not clear.
The reality of both women, human and flawed as they were, has frequently been lost.
There's something about both Anne and Mary that really resonates with people. We're still talking about them now, some 500 years later.
The sisters had a very complex relationship. It was neither hostile nor was it loving. It was a mixture of the two.
They lived in the court of a dangerous and powerful man, where there were unparalleled opportunities to rise, but where a single misstep could cost them their reputation, their family's fortune, and even their lives. This is a story of ambition and power, of desire and obsession, of a man who could take whatever he wanted, and 2 sisters who faced the consequences. Notorious though the women may still be, remarkably little is known for certain about much of their lives. What they looked like is disputed. The most famous portrait of Anne Boleyn was not painted in her lifetime, and the only image we have of Mary is now thought to be of someone else, perhaps even Anne. Nor is it certain when exactly the sisters were born.
Depressingly, it tended to be the births of male heirs that were well recorded. Girls were largely forgotten as a result.
If they'd been from a royal family, then they would have had their births recorded. The Boleyns were important, but in the grand scheme of things, they were quite a modest, moderate family, and it just wasn't considered important to write down the birthplaces and dates of these 2 girls.
Mary Boleyn is assumed to be the eldest because of various different pieces of evidence, none of which are absolutely conclusive. But probably the most compelling is that when her sister Anne was later granted a title, she's referred to simply as one of the daughters of Thomas Boleyn. If Anne had been the eldest, they would have said that in the grant.
The sisters were both probably born at Blickling Hall near Norwich, a few years either side of 1500. But much of their adolescence was spent in Kent. Hever Castle was the Boleyn family country estate. It was inherited by Mary and Anne's father Thomas in 1505. Thomas Boleyn was an ambitious courtier and diplomat. A gifted linguist, he ensured an excellent education for all his children, including his daughters.
If you had girls, you could just educate them to be wives, future mothers, so needlework, things like that, things that were considered useful for women. But if you were from a wealthier family, you'd teach them how to speak Latin, perhaps. Arithmetic would be important, so they would have had a good upbringing.
It was evident from quite early on that Anne was the precocious one. She's often referred to as being a very forward child, very intelligent, so it's clear that of the 2 sisters, she enjoys the greater intellect.
In around 1513, the adolescent Anne was sent to Europe. Her father had secured her a place at the court of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria. It was a coup for Anne and the Boleyns. The court was regarded as the foremost finishing school for young ladies in Europe.
Going to Margaret of Austria's court, I can't begin to describe what a big deal this was. It's like if you were a stage mom and you have the opportunity to put one of your children in a Steven Spielberg movie. It's like giving her that opportunity.
Margaret of Austria's court was known for being sort of quite flamboyant and artistic, and Margaret of Austria herself is supposed to have been a very kind and generous woman, and there is some evidence that she was actually very personally attached to Anne.
She immediately took to Anne. She recognised a kindred spirit. And what better education for the young Anne Boleyn than to be raised in one of the most cultured and civilised courts in the world?
Poor old Mary Boleyn was left behind doing her embroidery and seen pretty much as second best.
It would have been natural for Mary to resent her precocious younger sister. Mary's chance would come. In 1514, both Mary and Anne were chosen to serve as ladies-in-waiting to Henry VIII's younger sister, who was set to marry the King of France. Anne, however, was still at Margaret of Austria's court, so Mary went alone. The marriage was not a success. Louis XII died less than 3 months after the wedding. The crown passed to Louis's cousin, Francois. Soon afterwards, Anne joined her sister at the new French court. But the Boleyn girls would have very different experiences there.
At this point, you really start to see Anne and Mary's lives diverge. That Mary is the much more home-loving one. She doesn't really quite catch on to the quick, barbed intrigues of court life. That Anne just relishes the joust. She relishes the fight.
Claude of France let all the other ladies go back, but she offered to let Anne stay in court with her. This is a French queen, very cultured, very educated, very well-respected, but she wanted Anne.
Anne's life became very much based in France. For a good number of years, she kept those French affectations for the rest of her life.
Anne remained exposed to this highly artistic, cultivated Renaissance court. And she was certainly exposed to some very powerful women, the Queen Mother of France, Louise of Savoy, for one, and would have been able to see how women of influence and power were able to operate for themselves. And I think that time was incredibly formative in terms of the woman that she would become.
Anne would remain in France for 7 years. Mary had a less successful time at the French court. The new king was a notorious womanizer. It seems Mary was among his conquests, and word got out.
Mary soon caught the attention of Francois, who was very, very similar to Henry VIII, really. His mirror image in France, loved ladies, loved the finer things in life. And of course, Mary Boleyn was a famed beauty, so she soon caught his attention.
Mary disappeared from recorded history for the next 5 years. She was not at the French or English court. Some have speculated that she was sent away to a noble house in France. There, out of sight, her reputation could mend, and Mary could be schooled in the conduct expected of her. All we know for certain is that on the 4th of February 1520, Mary was in England, for that was the day she got married. King Henry VIII attended their wedding. Perhaps that was where Mary caught his eye, for soon afterwards, he began an affair with her.
Mary's affair with Henry VIII is fascinating because there is strong evidence to suggest that, in fact, she wasn't entirely complicit in this, and that Henry manoeuvred her into such a position that actually she was obliged to become his mistress.
He usually waited until a woman was married to seduce her, and any children that she had would have been claimed as the husband's. That was just the way things were done then.
There are lots of contradictions at the court of Henry VIII when it comes to love affairs. So, on the one hand, everything is governed by a very strict moral and chivalric code. It's all very romantic, but then beneath that, of course, it's a court full of ambitious young men, beautiful ladies. There are liaisons going on all over the place, and so the reality is a good deal less moral than Henry would like to project in public.
A woman at court is in a very difficult position particularly when the king importunes you. What are you going to do? Say no? He might banish you, he might banish your husband. He has all the power, and you don't have any at all.
In 1522, relations between England and France soured. Anne was summoned home to King Henry's court. Once again, she soon outshone her older sister. Even while Mary was the king's mistress and possibly had a child by him, she was overlooked by most at court. Anne was the star.
Anne stood out from other women in the English court because of that French influence, because of how long she'd spent there.
She's had an excellent education in France and also with Margaret of Austria. Now it's her time to shine in England.
There's always been people, male and female, who have what was called in the 1920s it. There's just something about them that's extra charismatic. And Anne had that coming out of her pores.
It is not known when Henry ended his affair with Mary. By 1526, however, it was certainly over, as he had found a new love. It was, of course, Anne Boleyn. In the 1520s, the lives of the Boleyn sisters revolved around Henry VIII. The elder, Mary, had a secret affair with the king and may even have borne him a child. In the middle of the decade, it was Anne who captured the king's desire. Her hold over him would last far longer and would have far greater consequences.
The affair between Mary and Henry began to fizzle out. It was partly because he always lost interest in his affairs, and he found her accommodating and very sweet, but not particularly interesting enough to catch him.
The popular misconception about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is that it was love at first sight. In fact, it takes Henry about 4 years to notice her. So it's in around 1526 that Anne seems to have finally caught the king's attention, and he makes a declaration of love for her. He makes no secret of her. Once he's fallen for Anne, then he falls big style. He is absolutely obsessed with her.
It could have been a week between him getting rid of one sister and moving on to the next. There could have been that crossover, could have been a couple of months. It would be tempting to think there was at least a little bit of crossover, because the more time he spends with Mary, the more likely Anne Boleyn is to be nearby.
Henry courted Anne in style. He showered her with gifts, he wrote these effusive love letters, he visited her, he really besieged her, tried to make her his mistress. But of course, Anne famously refused.
Anne kept the king at arm's length. She retreated to the family estate of Hever Castle, where she remained for 2 years. Her absence from court has been debated by historians for decades. Was it a scheme to heighten the king's desire, or was it a genuine attempt to end his obsession?
She packed up her stuff, she headed back to Hever, she stayed with her mom. That's not playing hard to get, that is hard to get. The last thing that's going to happen is a courtier from the 1500s being able to tell Henry VIII, back off.
I think, unlike her sister, Anne never allowed her heart to rule her head. She kept a certain degree of shrewd political acumen, but she had seen her sister set aside, and she believed, I think, that she had a purpose and a destiny. And I think ultimately Henry, being the alpha male of England, found that incredibly alluring and only incited him to pursue her more.
By 1527, King Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, could no longer bear children. Their 18-year marriage had produced just one surviving child, their daughter, Princess Mary. Henry was desperate for a son to continue the Tudor line. He became convinced that God himself was denying him. Catherine, after all, had once been married to his late brother. She insisted her first marriage was never consummated, but Henry would not be deterred.
Catherine won't have her marriage declared illegitimate, and so she was living in sin. That would also make her daughter a bastard and remove her from the line of succession. And there is this battle of wills.
We should be in no doubt that if Catherine had had a living son, none of this would have happened. Actually, they had a happy marriage for 20 years.
Instead of doing what he really should have done, finding another foreign princess to create a union with, instead, he let Anne gain this utter ascendancy over his heart, and he was determined to get her.
The thing is, once he was getting a divorce and he made it clear he wanted to marry her, there was no one else in that kingdom she could marry. There was no one that was going to risk his wrath to marry her. So her options were to become a nun or marry him.
Securing an annulment would not be easy. Henry entrusted the matter to his chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Over the next 5 years, lawyers and churchmen across Europe would grapple with the matter. As they did, the Boleyns grew more and more powerful.
Of course, to a family, a daughter's virtue is the most important thing. But if they think they can push their daughter in the way of the king and get some kind of power, influence, position, lands out of it, then they will. And so the Boleyns saw that they could get power out of Anne. They could use Anne as a conduit to the king.
But sickness nearly derailed everything. In the summer of 1528, there was an outbreak of the deadly sweating sickness. Anne herself fell ill with the disease, which could kill in hours. Much to the king's relief, she survived. The Boleyn family were not left unscathed. On the 22nd of June, the disease took Mary's husband, William Carey.
She was left with 2 young children to care for, and it's clear that she was, if not destitute, poor. And she was on the fringe, really, of her family.
It was thanks to Anne's intervention, in fact, that Mary was granted an annuity of £100.
Anne also took over the ward of her young son, Henry Carey. So that meant that, of course, Henry was no longer a financial burden upon Mary, and clearly Anne was there to step in and help out her sister. And there does seem to have been some bond of affection, sisterly affection between them, certainly at that time, although that would change.
The widowed Mary left court and returned to Hever Castle. Once again, she disappeared from recorded history for several years. Anne and the rest of her family had greater concerns. Little progress was being made in the annulment between Henry and Catherine.
Henry, being Henry, assumed that he would be able to get that dispensation from the Pope in Rome quite quickly, within a matter of months. However, of course, that didn't happen.
He was not prepared for this. Anne wasn't prepared for this. No one was prepared for how hard it would be.
Henry's in this impossible position. Catherine won't go. She won't retire. She won't say her marriage was consummated with Arthur. The Pope is backing her up. So is the Holy Roman Emperor. There doesn't seem to be any way of doing it, but he has to do it.
Rumours of the king's affair with Mary Boleyn were also spreading. They exposed the hypocrisy of Henry's case. For if Catherine's relationship with his brother made their marriage incestuous, then surely Henry's affair with Mary ruled out any connection to Anne. The ongoing failure to secure the annulment infuriated the king. He searched for somebody to blame.
Wolsey, of course, was an extremely powerful man at court for many years, the right-hand man of the king. He played an important part in trying to get the annulment of Henry's marriage from Catherine. However, he failed repeatedly, and I think Anne began to blame him for not pursuing the annulment as vigorously as she thought he might.
That was strike one for the cardinal. The second part was that he started to negotiate with Europe, and it was widely agreed that if Henry cast Anne aside, it would be much easier to negotiate. When Anne found out, she was horribly offended. She was absolutely furious, and she refused to have anything to do with Wolsey. And she essentially said to Henry, you know, you have to sort this out. She wouldn't stand for it.
Wolsey was a brilliant statesman, very shrewd, but he miscalculated. He thought Anne was just another of Henry's short-lived love interests and that she would soon be out of court. Of course, that was a grave miscalculation, and he paid the price.
Wolsey was banished from London. He was accused of treason and ordered to return only to face the charges. He died on the journey. With Wolsey dead, Anne grew more powerful, and she gained a new ally in the figure of Thomas Cromwell. He shared Anne's sympathies for reforming the church and, with her support, soon had the king's ear. He tried a different approach to Wolsey, and King Henry would be declared supreme head of the English church. Nobody would then be able to deny him. Anne's years of waiting were nearly over. In 1531, Henry dismissed his wife from court. He would never see her again. Anne was queen in all but name. Early in 1533, Henry and Anne were finally married.
Henry and Anne's wedding was so secret that we can't be absolutely sure when it took place. It was probably the 25th of January 1533 at Whitehall.
At the time, the king was still married to Catherine of Aragon, so technically he was a bigamist at this point.
There would have been only a handful of witnesses. It would have been a very low-key affair. And in the end, it was rushed through, and for good reason, because Anne was already pregnant.
Henry had banished his wife of 2 decades. He had broken with the Roman Catholic Church, and he had enraged half the country. All for Anne. All for the son she would give him. It was Anne's greatest triumph. Her family were the most influential in the land. Even Mary, still secluded at Hever Castle, would rise alongside her sister. Victory seemed total. But this Boleyn supremacy would prove short-lived. In 1533, the long years of waiting were over. Parliament passed laws to strip the Catholic Church of its authority in England. Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, finally forced through the annulment of the king's first marriage. And Anne and Henry were finally wed. All was set. That June, the pregnant Anne Boleyn was at last crowned Queen of England.
Anne Boleyn's coronation was an extraordinarily lavish affair, the like of which had never been seen in England. Henry went to great expense. There were pageants and celebrations across the capital.
There was a procession of barges down the river. The celebrations went on for 4 days. Thousands of people turned out to watch the spectacle. There was feasting. She was carried in a litter through streets and people were performing plays. So it was 4 days of festivities, all for her. So it must have felt like she was the second most important person in the world.
She'd done what no other woman had ever done before. She grabbed the king for herself. And most of all, she was really the true wife of the king. He was in love with her. It wasn't an arranged marriage that he'd done for dynastic purposes. He was utterly in love with her. And so she was now the queen.
The public despised Anne Boleyn. She had very few supporters. They saw her as usurping the rightful queen, Catherine of Aragon, who was greatly beloved of the people.
Anne's widowed sister Mary returned to court. She was appointed as one of the new Queen's ladies-in-waiting, but again, her time at a royal court proved an unhappy one. As she wrote later in a letter, "I saw that all the world did set so little by me." She bore the brunt of her sister's unpopularity and was keenly aware of it. All were convinced that the new Queen would grant Henry what he desired most. In September 1533, Anne went into labour and gave birth to a baby girl.
The birth of Elizabeth was a catastrophe. Yes, she was healthy. Yes, she was strong. But she was a girl. He'd been convinced it was a boy, and to him, it was an omen.
It made a mockery of everything he had gone through to marry Anne and to set aside his first wife, because the only reason that Anne would have been accepted by the population of England would have been if she'd given birth to a prince, an heir.
The minute that that baby was declared a female, that was the beginning of the end.
The birth of another unwanted girl only deepened the growing unhappiness in Anne and Henry's marriage. Their long courtship had perhaps set impossible expectations on both sides. Henry blamed Anne for the failure to provide him a son, and Anne struggled with the change from mistress to wife.
Anne was an incredibly intelligent woman, much cleverer than the king, and so she wanted to help him rule. But what she found was that Henry expected certain things of a queen.
She wasn't cut out to be the wife of the king. Now, Henry was used to a wife who was compliant, she knew her duties, to be very much in the background. That wasn't Anne's style at all. She wasn't prepared to turn a blind eye to his indiscretions, and when she knew that he was starting to pay attention to other ladies, she was furious and she upbraided him in front of his courtiers, which he hated.
A woman who was very religious, who had refused to become the king's mistress no matter what, that's when you get all the stories of Anne's bad temper. Well, how she didn't just start stabbing Henry, I don't know.
Despite their quarrels, Anne soon fell pregnant again. In 1534, she had almost reached full term when she had a miscarriage. She lost the baby. It was a boy.
Her second pregnancy, she flaunted it, of course. She was very confident. She famously talked about her cravings and really showed off the fact that she was expecting again.
Anne lost that child very late into that pregnancy, possibly into about the 7th or 8th month, which would have been an extremely traumatic event for her. Henry seems to have been absolutely beside himself. That was clearly a very emotionally destructive event for the two of them.
Anne fell pregnant again quite quickly, but we start to see the same pattern as we see with Catherine of Aragon. Failed pregnancies, miscarriages, simply pregnancies that will not go to term. And every time pregnancy fails, Henry loves Anne a little less.
Anne had lost a child and was losing Henry. The sadness and anger she felt were heightened by the actions of her sister. In the late summer of 1534, just weeks after Anne's miscarriage, Mary reappeared at court. She was clearly pregnant. In secret, Mary had remarried. Her new husband was a man named William Stafford, a man with no title or fortune to speak of. Something shocking and incomprehensible had happened. Mary had married for love.
Women have no right to marry for love. They marry for security, they marry for money, they marry for their family's prospects. That's what they're there for.
In those days, you certainly had to ask your father for permission. And when your sister is the Queen of England, you certainly have to ask her. And Mary didn't do either of these things, probably because she knew that she would be turned down. The person she chose, just a lowly soldier. He had no social standing. He certainly wasn't good enough for a sister of the Queen.
It's at precisely this moment when Anne is really struggling to give Henry a son, or indeed just another living child, that her sister Mary arrives at court. She's newly married and she's pregnant. One can't help but suspect she's showing off, really.
Anne and the rest of the family were furious with Mary. She was banished from court. There would be no allowance to support her this time. The two sisters would never meet again.
Mary was very shocked at the severity of her sister's reaction and indeed the king's reaction. And she was probably quite hurt and a little bit panic-stricken because I think she just accepted it as a given that as the new Queen's sister, her place at court was assured.
In a letter to Cromwell, Mary wrote, "Good Master Secretary, sue for us to the King's Highness, and beseech His Highness, whichever was wont to take pity, to have pity on us."
Why did she write to Cromwell? Well, he is the most powerful man in England next to the king. He's the new chief minister, really, of Henry VIII. And it's thanks to Cromwell, I think, that Anne Boleyn is on the throne. He, in the end, had arranged that annulment, had put Anne on the throne. So, of course, Mary is pleading to Cromwell to help her, but I'm afraid her pleas fall on deaf ears.
By now, the wily Cromwell was no friend to Anne. He may have helped her become queen, but the pair clashed repeatedly. After England's break with Rome, a wealthy prize was up for grabs, the land and property of the monastic orders. But Anne and Cromwell disagreed on how to spend the money.
Thomas Cromwell sent his hit squads all over England looking at how much money the monasteries had. And Anne felt that the money of the monasteries, if it was taken from them, should be used for good works and creating educational opportunities given to charity. Cromwell felt very clearly they should be given to the royal coffers to give Henry a boost.
She didn't want the dissolution of the monasteries. She thought that, and that may actually be what killed her.
Anne had her preacher preach a sermon which drew parallels between how Cromwell was dealing with the dissolution of the monasteries and pocketing some of the money, perhaps not for himself, perhaps not into worthy causes. And I think Cromwell found this sermon very threatening and began to think, this is you or me, and it was a matter of survival.
Anne was standing between Thomas Cromwell and money. That turned out to be not a good place to stand.
Anne made a great mistake in making this powerful enemy in Thomas Cromwell, because if he wanted to bring her down, he could.
It was Cromwell who would engineer Anne's fall. When it came, it was sudden and dramatic. Within weeks of celebrating the death of Catherine of Aragon in early 1536, Anne had yet another miscarriage. It was her last chance. Just months later, Anne was arrested on charges of treason. On the 2nd of May, 1536, she was taken to the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn's fall was as sudden as it was brutal. Henry VIII had pursued her obsessively for nearly a decade. Now, just 3 years after becoming queen, Anne faced trial and execution.
Anne was now in an incredibly vulnerable position. Henry clearly was losing interest in Anne. He'd also lost faith in her, I think. So she hadn't delivered the son that he desired. His eyes had fallen upon a new lady at court, Jane Seymour.
Jane Seymour was the opposite of Anne. She was sweet, she was gentle, she was retiring, and Henry became obsessed by the fact that he must marry Jane and have a son with her.
There was one man who had the power and cunning to dispatch a queen. After all, he had done it once already.
I think most historians now agree that Thomas Cromwell really was the person who thought up and conspired the plot against Anne.
Now, Thomas Cromwell knows an annulment won't work this time round. He has to get rid of Anne permanently, and so he devises this gossip.
He managed to secure confessions of ladies of Anne's chamber who placed accusations towards the Queen about her impropriety with other gentlemen of the King's chamber.
Anne was accused of adultery with not just one, but 5 men, including her own brother George. Now, it's no coincidence that every single one of those 5 men were enemies of Thomas Cromwell. He's killing 2 birds with the same stone.
By claiming incest, it made Henry look less bad. If she had just committed adultery with one man, maybe it was because Henry was failing her. But if she was so lascivious and disgusting that she would sleep even with her brother, well, that's clearly not Henry's fault. That's clearly something wrong with her. So he went to Henry, whispered his little poison in Henry's ear, and then Henry became, as far as anybody can tell, sincerely convinced that Anne Boleyn must have been sleeping with 100 men. When she would have had time to do this while surrounded by a billion other people and not even sleeping alone in the same room? Magic, I assume.
For the crimes of adultery, incest, and treason, there could be only one punishment. Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May. 5 men, including Anne's brother George, joined her in the Tower of London.
When she arrived at the Tower, she knew she was never going back. It was not going to be a fair trial.
In those first few days, she seems to have undergone some kind of breakdown. She was distraught. There was a lot of incoherent ramblings as she mused on what must have been brought against her. Cromwell, of course, made good use of that.
During Anne's imprisonment in the Tower, she'd become almost hysterical at one point, famously putting her hands around her neck and saying, you know, I have a little neck, the execution won't take long. But towards the very end, her bravery shone through.
The first trials were held on the 12th of May. 3 courtiers and a musician were accused of adultery with the Queen. All 4 were found guilty and condemned to death. 3 days later, Anne and her brother were put on trial. The indictment accused Anne of despising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king, and following daily her frail and carnal lust. Anne was faced with a jury of peers, presided over by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. But by now, she was beyond the help of her family.
In a Tudor court, once somebody had been accused of a crime, then they were assumed to be guilty of that crime, unless they could prove themselves innocent.
Gotta remember, the only man to confess sleeping with Anne was the only man low-born enough to have been legally tortured. There's no proof he was tortured, but he's still the only guy that confessed. Men that could not legally be tortured, every single one of them went to their grave saying they were innocent.
It was a ragbag of gossip and tittle-tattle woven together, which fabricated the case against her.
It was not going to be a fair trial. It was a done deal. She was going to be found guilty of adultery with all these men, and so as a consequence, they and she were going to be publicly executed.
On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed.
Henry gave her one act of mercy, which was that rather than an axe, he called for a French swordsman to come over, especially from France, and cut off her head in one little chop.
Beheading by the sword was much swifter, much cleaner than by the axe. So it was one last favour that Henry showed towards Anne.
Then she knelt in the straw, arranged her skirts behind her. And it is said at some point that she turned briefly to the swordsman, and at that point he called out for the boy to get the sword from beneath the straw. And as she looked round in the direction of that voice, the swordsman struck with one clean stroke, and her neck was taken from her body.
Only days before the execution, Henry had his marriage to Anne annulled by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate.
He was making absolutely sure of it. It wasn't enough to have her executed for adultery. He had to have the marriage dissolved too.
He needed to clear the path to any offspring that he would have with Jane Seymour. He did so according to the fact that he had had previous relationships with Anne's sister Mary. This brought the 3 of them into the first degree of affinity, which was against kind of moral and church law, and meant that any union which Anne and Henry had entered into could not be a valid one, and that was grounds to declare the marriage null and void.
After her execution, Anne was buried in the chapel of the Tower of London. Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days later. She, at last, would give him the son he had so longed for. Edward was born the following October. Jane died soon after the birth, and despite marrying 3 more times, Henry would have no more children. He died in 1547. Anne's sister Mary lived in obscurity for the rest of her life. There is no proof Mary ever reconciled with what was left of her family. After her father died in 1539, Mary inherited the Boleyn estate and became a wealthy woman.
We don't even know if she was in London or in court. There is no record of what she thought about the demise of her sister or her brother, unfortunately.
Her family had been publicly shamed and the terrible aspersions had been cast on them. It was very clear to her that there would be no place for her in the future of court, in the future of aristocratic life in Britain.
She goes into obscurity. We don't know much about her life thereafter, and that may have been deliberate. She knew when to keep a low profile.
Mary has often been seen as rather lacking in intelligence, the stupidest Boleyn. Even though the Boleyns were disgraced and suffered a lot, and both her brother and sister were executed, she stayed out of it and was not dragged into the case or the trial or the execution. So perhaps in the end, she's rather cleverer than we gave her credit for.
Mary died on the 19th of July, 1543. Her resting place, as with so many details of Mary's life, is unknown. She died of natural causes in a loving marriage and fine home, which is more than can be said for her sister. Anne and Mary's offspring would shape British history for centuries. Mary's children became knights and courtiers, and one of her descendants now sits on the throne of England. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was restored to the succession. She went on to become one of the greatest monarchs in British history. In their own times, few valued the Boleyn sisters beyond their potential to catch a powerful man's eye, to give him pleasure, or grant him a son.
I think the legacy of both of them is the fact that we're still talking about them now, some 500 years later.
Anne Boleyn was a force of nature. She was a woman ahead of her time in so many ways. And she was such a pivotal and important part of the Reformation that she really changed the landscape.
Mary, by contrast, was far more conventional. She was a well-to-do lady who became a royal mistress and then led a comfortable life thereafter.
It is a crying shame that both of those women are still slut-shamed for things that were beyond their control. So I think their legacy is tarnished, and it shouldn't be. Their legacy should be that they were strong. They did the best they could with what they had, and then they were punished for being too good at it.
They have a legacy of their own, in their actions and identities as individuals, as women, as sisters.